So welcome to the latest Assurance and Accountability meeting, which is focused on the independent inquiry into child sexual exploitation in Telford. Today's session, as you know, Chief, is focused on the recommendations that made, and indeed the force's progress around how they are meant. Really grateful for yourself and the Deputy Chief Constable joining. I know you already know my deputy and Claire Richardson, who leads from a policy and commissioning point of view in my office and has been the central officer in my office around responding to the ITSE recommendations. Really important that we today just remind ourselves that these are recommendations are set by the inquiry. There are lots of other work around this particular area of crime that's caused in our society, but this is particularly focused on the recommendations and how the force working against them. Child sexual exploitation is a horrific crime, and I know that I, as Commissioner, have it within my plan, and indeed I know that West Mercia Police have it as a key force priority to ensure that we can safeguard children across West Mercia, and indeed particularly learning the lessons from places like Telford, where the inquiry has highlighted some issues in our history, and indeed some issues that we still have to progress. I'm also particularly keen to ensure that the voices of victims and survivors are also heard as part of that journey that we will follow, not only in policing but also in society. So as part of the build-up to this ANA session, we have also sought the views of victims and survivors in guiding some of the areas that we are likely to want to understand further. And that's really important, that those that have been the subject to this terrible behaviour in our society, that we use their experience to help shape fixing some of the issues that need that progression. As you'll know, back in 2018, Telford and Wrekin Borough Council commissioned that judge-led independent inquiry. It reported in July 22 47 recommendations for stakeholders and organisations, and I think there are some 13, particularly for West Mercia Police, and those are the ones that we will focus on in a while. Since the report was published in 22, we've held a number of sessions, as you'll know, either in your current role or your former role, supporting and challenging the force around how those recommendations are understood and indeed progress. And back in 2016, right at the beginning of my term, one of my first meetings in terms of holding to account, as it was described then, was around CSE. It was the very first meeting that I held. We've also held more recent meetings with your predecessor, and I know that very shortly the judge that led the inquiry will be checking to see what progress has been made. So a very timely opportunity for us to assess where we are, and indeed understand where there might be further gaps or indeed progress still to be made. Before we move on to the recommendations, because we're going to go through the recommendations one by one, Alex, so I just think it's worth an opportunity for you to reflect as to both the inquiry, but also the position that the force has articulated since the inquiry's come out, and hearing your view and reflection.
Thank you, Commissioner and team. I think it's fair to say that the reason why most people join the police is because they want to make a difference. They want to protect people from this type of crime. And when we read Tom Crowder's report and what people had to experience in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and still today, our heart goes out to them. We should have, at those times, treated those victims differently. We didn't. Richard at the time apologised. I apologise again now for the failings that we made at those times. Policing often has been victim-led, i.e. back in those days, if a victim says, I don't want to complain, then the police officer would often take no further action. And they didn't understand the heart of child sexual exploitation, which was exploitation, a power imbalance, coercion, and we should have looked further, we should have dug deeper, we should have understood the pressure that those people were under, and we should have done more, and we didn't. And for that's had an impact on people, and we are sorry. And we're also committed to making a difference, which is why I welcome this report. I welcome the recommendations. You've highlighted the recommendations. I look forward to going into those recommendations. What I would say is, as West Mercia Police, we're a learning organisation. We have a lot more to do. We have a lot more to do beyond ITSE, beyond Telford, across the whole of the establishment. And both my Deputy Chief Constable and my senior team are committed to continually improve in this area. I think it's fair to say, as an organisation, we have worked really hard on these recommendations. We've put dedicated leadership into it. We have had a really detailed and forensic approach to understanding, have we met these recommendations or not. Today, we'll be honest with you where we've met them, where we think there's still work to do. We'll highlight that there's still work to do, but hopefully offer you some reassurance and the people of West Mercia reassurance that we're on this. This is the police's job. So I'm happy now, if you're okay, to dig into some of those recommendations.
So prior to this meeting, we commission, as is our process, we commission a report from the force. So earlier in the year, we set a terms of reference for a report that I've now got, and that is the force's briefing, your view around this issue, and that's what we will be working through. But just to be clear around the things that I focused in those terms of reference, there were 3 particular commitments within my Safer West Mercia plan: putting victims and their voice at the heart of the criminal justice system, improving responses outcomes around sexual violence, and ensure a robust response to serious and organised crime to reduce the harm it causes in our community. In the terms of reference, more widely, empowering you to add any view that you also wanted to add, and indeed to use existing products where they exist. But the overall focus of the product being an executive overview of West Mercia Police's activity in response to the independent child sexual exploitation recommendations, and consideration should be given around capturing the risks and challenges, as you alluded to, it being in the executive voice, and it should demonstrate an understanding of the survivor voice and how this has been utilised to inform activity and then any next steps. So that just gives a bit of context to the briefing note that we've also got access to. As you say, I'm going to run through the individual recommendations. So let's move on then to recommendation 1.
Thank you. Recommendation 1 is the establishment of a joint CSE review group with all our key partners, Telford and Reeking NHS Trust, the council and others. Pleased to say that that has established. It meets regularly. All partners are active and committed to tackling CSE in Telford. We can take some of the learning from that across the rest of West Mercia, but that function has been operating well, and if we go on to the second one, has produced an annual report.
So the theme around the first question, around the engagement also of the leaders within West Mercia Police into this issue, and particularly in Telford, have you got assessment over say the last couple of years of the senior leaders' engagement in and around this issue, both in the establishment of this group, but also the wider partnership, and indeed lived experience type groups who also want their voice heard?
So, as you know, Commissioner, I joined West Mercia Police 18 months ago. As soon as I joined, it was clearly apparent to me that ITSE And the recommendations were made were high on the agenda of the executive and the senior leadership team of West Mercia Police, and as was ACC Crime, then Richard Cooper. And we have dedicated senior leaders, currently Leanne Lowe, Superintendent, with some of her team who work with the joint CSE review group. And I think we're committed, and certainly the feedback we get from our senior staff is that they see commitment from the other agencies in that group as well.
So, just to be clear, you're content with the senior engagement of the organisation in Telford in and around this issue at the moment. Do you think that's always been the case in let's say, the last 5 years? I know you weren't necessarily here, but the organisation existed here. As in, do you think it has improved, and indeed then have the lessons of maybe the lack of engagement? Because I suppose it's predicated in the question is that I don't necessarily believe that level of engagement has been there in recent time.
I can speak from myself and my predecessor and say that for the last 2 years, I know that our commitment has been strong, and the commitment and engagement has been right to the top, to the Chief Constable. For the years preceding that, Commissioner, that I'm not aware. Richard, have you got a longer term view of our level of engagement or commitment there?
I think the engagement has been growing. I think it grew primarily as a result of our failings following Operation Chalice. I'd reiterate the Chief's points in respect of the last 2 years, and perhaps I could just set out from my perspective some of the engagement at different levels. So in respect of recommendation one and the review group, that group is primarily there to understand the scale and nature of CSE. So it's concerned primarily with what does the data tell us, and our head of analysis and insight has been engaged with that group from the outset, remains a member of the group, and meets regularly with other members. The Chief alluded to our dedicated designated lead for ITSE being our Detective Superintendent for Safeguarding and Vulnerability. She is the most senior officer in the force whose role is dedicated to the protection of vulnerable people in the community. And we would see the benefit of that person being the lead in that she has force-wide responsibility. So we can take the learning from Telford, but we have also ensured that the local superintendent, the local chief inspector have engaged with the inquiry and with the lived experience consultees as well, with my role and me as an individual providing senior oversight and having very frequent meetings with the superintendent to understand progress being made.
Is it, the reason why I'm interested in it as a line is ensuring or getting the reassurance that the views of those who are obviously the practitioners, but also the lived experience of those who've been subject to this terrible crime are also heard into the senior levels.
Part of being a senior leader in the organisation is hearing the victim's voice. It's right at the heart of your Safer West Mercia plan. You put victims number one. As Temporary Chief Constable at the moment, you know my commitment to hearing the voice of the victim. We are, as you know, putting it even on the walls so that we can really influence the culture of the organisation to always think about the victim first. And personally, when I meet our frontline officers and I meet frontline victims, is where I learn the most, and it's part of the integrity, I think, of being a chief officer, is to be able to hear what's going on the ground and making a difference. Both that, and I often rely on your office as well, as you often meeting victims to come back to me and relay to me some of the concerns that you might have. And then further to the actual meeting, we have performance regimes in place, particularly around victims code, putting the victim at the heart of what we do, where our Deputy Chief Constable holds our senior leaders to account for compliance with that victims code, where we treat people with dignity and respect, we give them updates on investigations, and we ensure that they're made aware of progress of those investigations.
Perhaps, perhaps I could just give an example. So I obviously read the annual report that was produced last year. We're working towards the second version in July. The joint CSE review group have come up with 10 actions, 10 recommendations arising from the work that they've done. One is particularly relevant to policing in an analysis of perhaps shared characteristics of perpetrators so that we might better inform our intervention activity. That has been brought to me in my conversations with Leanne as the Detective Superintendent, who has picked it up from Julia. So Leanne has, as the Detective Superintendent, has overall oversight of everything that's going on. And I have very frequent discussions with her that then follow up her or her deputies' weekly meetings, as they have been for some months, with
Let's move on then to recommendation 2. We've touched on some of it already, but
Yeah, we have, and as Richard's just mentioned, we've got the report, we've got it here now. I also read it. It's got a number of recommendations. It's an annual report, and I think it's really a healthy way to say, okay, how are things changing, and what's our response to how things are changing. I think our data sharing arrangements are good with the group that enables us to do the analysis, and we can look across the range of CSE offences and intelligence and information and draw conclusions and pictures of what's going on both in Telford, but then we take some of the learning on how that's taken place and we apply it in other areas as well.
So are you reassured that you've got the right governance and oversight within West Mercia Police to make sure the bits that are coming back from things like that annual report, the bits that need to be actioned, changed, gripped, all the other bits and pieces, that there's the right governance process in the organisation to make it happen with the right senior leadership oversight?
Yes, so interestingly, we've had a lot of governance in this space, and our ACC, Rachel Jones, who is our current crime ACC at the moment, she's running a child protection gold and is working with Leanne Lowe on refining those arrangements, where Leanne chairs 3 subgroups of a child protection gold group that looks across all the different facets and governance and has a strong capability to receive, assess and develop progress against those.
So a gold group being the police's structure for the most serious things that need organisational grip and need commanding.
Yes, and it's a gold group for child protection across the board. So that might be paedophilia, it might be child abuse, it might be CEE, so criminal exploitation of children, or the child sexual exploitation of children, and sometimes those cross over. It could be how our patrol officers, when they go to a domestic abuse job, how are they being professionally curious? How are we getting the voice of the child when we go to a domestic abuse incident? So it covers that wide array of implications for being child-centred in what we do. But it is well governed, and the subgroups that Leanne Lowe again chairs give me reassurance that we are continually pushing and improving our governance in this space.
Okay. Let's move on then to recommendation 3.
So recommendation 3 is similar in that what we would call in policing a problem profile. We understand the nature, the prevalence, the frequency and the typology of CSE offending across West Mercia. It's important for us because that dictates our strategic focus and our tactical focus, and that is taking place.
In terms of the part of the recommendation around being shared across the partners, in effect, West Mercia has had criticism at different points in my time here around its ability to work with partners, i.e. sharing information or joining up of intent. Are you reassured here that West Mercia Police is first of all doing the first part, which I think you said you are, but have you got an assessment as to how well it is being shared across and therefore informing operational activity of other partners?
So I'll bring Richard in a bit. I have a view that I would like the way we share data and focus around CSE to be replicated with our partners, to be replicated in other areas. So I think where we do it best is in relation to CSE in Telford, across many different aspects. It could be taxi licensing, it could be restaurants, it could be intel sharing with children's services. I think in actual fact that demonstrates what we should be doing in other areas where I think we still need to improve. That could be serious organised crime, it could be other areas and data sharing agreements, but I think it is good. Of course, it's always space for improvement, but I'd like to see it more in other areas.
Yeah, we acknowledge and understand that crimes related to child sexual exploitation are frequently under-recorded based on reporting to the police. So we found, if we consider the prevalence data as being the amount of CSE that's recorded, the offenders and the mapping in terms of geographically where that's going on in terms of our intelligence, that relatively small numbers of offences compared to other sorts of crime are being recorded. And so we, with partners, have considered the extent to which any hotspots of activity do or don't exist. We find it more beneficial in our engagement with other agencies involved to look at the individuals involved, the types of places where CSE is happening. For example, the greatest number being within private dwellings, second after that being purely online offending as opposed to physical offending, and sharing that information to better understand the situation. I've given the specific example around the work arising in terms of perpetrator characteristics. There are others that we'll come on to in terms of sharing information regarding food outlets, in terms of taxi licensing, that I think will bring to life some of the meaningful exchange of information between partners.
If you can forgive the intrusion, I think it might be worth just spending a bit of time talking about what we mean by CSE.
Okay.
And I think it will lay the foundation for future discussions as well. So child sexual exploitation, there is a national definition. It's child abuse, and then it's child abuse where there is a power imbalance, where normally the adult will use against the child some form of deception, manipulation or coercion to receive sexual activity in return for something that the victim wants. And that could be anything from money, drugs, love, vapes, all sorts of things. That's the sort of national definition of CSE. You can see that that is quite a wide definition. When we talk about the ITSE report, there's another view, and it's a typology of CSE, which is what comes to mind when we think about child sexual exploitation. So Rotherham, Oxford, some of the abuse we saw here in Telford, where young girls are commodified and sold between man to man to man and abused and may or may not think, because of the power imbalance, that they are victims or not. That is a sort of typology of CSE, but you can see that there might be other versions of child sexual exploitation. And, since this time and increasing every year is the amount of abuse that goes online. And this is where it becomes slightly more vague. So, many of us here are parents of children. We've got concerns with our children online. When someone online is engaging with someone else, a child online, and there's a request for photos, as is so often the case, to what extent is there a power imbalance? To what extent is there child sexual exploitation going on? It may fit that national definition, but it certainly doesn't fit the definition of someone being commodified and sold from man to man to man. But it might be that the victim does want something. It might be that they don't, in which case, does it fit the CSE criteria or does it not? We might not know the identity of the person who's online trying to get the child to be involved in the sexual activity. They might be purporting to be a child, and they may be. The final thing I'd say is the amount of child abuse online is increasing all the time. And only last month, a national report was published that showed that for the first time, just over 50% of offending online from a child sexual abuse point of view was child on child. And so when we move later on into some of the markers and definitions, it's important to understand there's quite a broad church of offending that takes place here, and it can be subjective and complex. And whilst there is definitely a typology of commodifying young girls and selling them from man to man to man, there's also variance in that, how that CSE can take place.
Thank you. Very helpful in terms of context. I'm going to move on to recommendation 6.
So this is really important recommendation from ITSE around making sure all our staff are trained in relation to information sharing, and therefore they information share. I'm really keen that my staff information share. We used to call it dare to share. Anything in relation to concerns around child sexual abuse, child sexual exploitation, we should be sharing information. Do our staff feel confident to do that? Our staff are concerned around data protection legislation, and they need to be in the right place to understand what's taking place. So the College of Policing won the training. It's online training. We are fairly confident that well over 90% of our staff have completed that online training in relation to information sharing. Again, there's more we can do there because it should be 100%, shouldn't it? Yes, there's information sharing training. Yes, we monitor compliance with it. We are, as far as compliance is concerned for NCAL training, we're at the top end of compliance, but it doesn't explicitly talk about CSE, and we think it'd be valuable if it should. So anything more on that, Rich? So,
only to say that there are some benefits, I think, in the College of Policing, ensuring that there's a standard across the country in terms of acceptability and consistency in terms of information sharing training. And we want our officers and staff to understand the legal bases on which they can share information. And those legal bases would apply in cases of domestic abuse, child exploitation and other crimes. So we want there to be greater focus on CSE and hence ensuring that information sharing training is included within the CSE training. Practically speaking, I would want officers to be able to apply those same judgments to other sorts of harmful crimes because the same legal gateways exist for them to do so.
Talking explicitly about CSE and looking at some of the basis to which best practice gets developed, i.e. the college, some of the college basis it feels old, outdated, as it were. How do you balance the need that this needs to happen in West Mercia versus the bits you've talked on over contributing to the national elements, as in would benefit the national? How do we make sure that our communities in West Mercia also can get the reassurance that its local police service are progressing an issue that's a thorny issue and affects lots of different people? But you know, I'm the Commissioner for West Mercia, or the Chief for West Mercia. How do we balance the progress of the two?
There's a number of ways. There's mechanisms and there's leadership, and the two intertwine. I think from the top, from my executive team, do we say it's important for the organisation? Yes, we do. I know it's not CSE, but the horrific murder of Alfie Steele is another red flag to us around data sharing, and that we should be information sharing as much as possible. Every child safeguarding review says that there were missed opportunities across the country, missed opportunities for data sharing. ACC Rachel Jones has a national portfolio in relation to this, so brings a lot of expertise to West Mercia. So what we say as leaders is important because our organisation listens to us. But then how we manage the performance around information sharing is important. So yes, might be dated College of Policing training, but it's important that our staff do it. And then to your point around what about even better than that? And I think that's where we look at the NWG training and our commitment in spring this year to get that training package out to everybody that really highlights it in the context of CSE.
So you touched on a little bit, I think, in what you said initially around the role that victim survivors and lived experience groups can have some input into and their views taken into account. Is it, just to be clear, is it your commitment that West Mercia Police will ensure that those voices are included in ultimately whatever products are used by the organisation?
Yes, and it's something we need to be really thoughtful about because we have a lot of training products. Some from the bottom up are created by staff on their own initiative, and some by our L&D department. How do you get that voice of the child or voice of the victim into everything we do? I think there will be circumstances where we missed it, but we're committed to it. As you hold me to account, and it's the heart of the Safer West Mercia plan.
how we, as an aside, how we as a system ensure that we are supporting those who are who want to give their lived experience, to do that, as in not having to do it over and over again, as in the learning from it is captured rather than having to be repeated, and those individuals supported. Because I do hear regularly from victims and survivors, they have to tell their story a lot in the criminal justice process, and then sometimes have to tell their story a lot in terms of making sure that the different organisations who should benefit from their experience perhaps don't always join up as to how we capture that experience and then learn from it. I want to move on to recommendation 8, if we can, please, Alex.
Yes, so we have committed to, for the next 5 years, in writing, dedicated child CSE team in Telford, and we've got CSE teams across all our local policing areas in Telford. We've got an inspector in what we call PVP, Protecting Vulnerable People, who has 2 detective sergeants who answer to them in Telford. One detective sergeant specialises in child criminal exploitation, one detective sergeant specialises in CSE, and then a team of detectives, police staff underneath them, who both raise awareness, go out on operations with taxis, restaurants, and investigate the child sexual exploitation and any crossovers there are with CEE, child criminal exploitation.
In terms of capacity, an area of business for which sometimes, well, I'm seeking your reassurance as to whether or not there is enough capacity. In preparation for today, we've been able to look at different caseloads that the teams hold, which seem, as civilians, seem high. Are you reassured that that there is enough capacity within what has been committed to, as you've just alluded?
Yes, I am, because this is in our control strategy. It's a priority for the organisation. So if there was not enough capacity within, for example, a CSE team, it's all hands to the pump. So reactive CID, our conventional PVP teams, all should be involved in this. So because this is a priority offence for us, I think it will always get the capacity that it deserves and needs. The issue here, of course, is some of the unreported offences, and how do we understand and investigate those offences that haven't come to our attention. And we need the public support, and we need parents and guardians to be vigilant so that that awareness can be raised to us. On occasion, we are made aware of multiple offences taking place where, again, victims for a whole set of understandable reasons don't want to come forward, and sometimes we put a specialist team in place, and we have recently done that in Telford for a different offence type.
We do see that there's benefit in the detective constables within that child exploitation team being able to surge their effort towards one or the other to take account of the crossovers between the two. For example, a child who's been exploited into the world of drugs may also then be sexually exploited by way of so-called drugs, debts, etc. So there are crossovers from our professional experience, but we used to have 2 detective sergeants who supervised the work of the team directly as a result of the consultee's feedback. And from that victim perspective, we now have one of the sergeants dedicated to the oversight of CSE as a safeguard, so that CSE, as opposed to CCE, is never marginalised within the work of that team.
So could I then ask, given that experience in Telford, is that something that you're considering doing in other local policing areas across West Mercia, having dedicated resource, a dedicated sergeant DS for CSE? Is that something you're going to be doing in others?
Yeah, so it explicitly features within what we would term our beyond its commitments to examine the resourcing and makeup of the teams across West Mercia. The teams vary in size depending on the perceived threat. So going back to the point around what's our understanding of the problem, but it is part of the work to consider, are the teams across the rest of the force resourced appropriately, and are the structures appropriate in terms of dedicated supervisory roles?
How does, and it's probably somewhere in the series of recommendations, but I'm going to pick it here. How does and the Chief alluded to earlier around the definition of CSE that is used, but the society doesn't present things sometimes as clearly as we want to be able to define them. We've seen a lot of progress around the understanding around modern slavery and human trafficking. For example, there's been some legislative progress in terms of tools available to the team, to the police and partners. How do I get some reassurance that the knowledge and development around understanding the impact of modern slavery and human trafficking, and indeed progress around CSE, that there is some joining up appropriately of the two things, because as I come back to, it's unlikely to be as clear cut as we would always want it to be.
I think you can be reassured from a number of perspectives. So in relation to modern slavery, human trafficking, over 60 staff who have undergone specialist training, and we are undergoing more training in relation to that. And again, a bit like child sexual exploitation, definitionally it's been on a journey. So conventionally you'd think of either sex work or forced labour in relation to modern slavery, sometimes domestic servitude as well. Increasingly that's become a much wider definition. So a 16-year-old drug dealer working for a 22-year-old drug dealer is under some form of power imbalance and control. So that also is subject to human trafficking. So the first point is our skills in relation to human trafficking, and quite a lot of capacity, I think, and expertise there. Then I think the structures with PVP across the force, I think, are good and strong, and definitions are good and strong. I think in some areas we need to look at resourcing and make sure we're up to strength. The third area is in relation to the CSE teams and the criminal exploitation teams, a lot of expertise. And then we've got the violence against women and girls coordinators that you funded last year, which also sit on each LPA that can have a look and understand concerns in those areas. So subjectivity, we'd all like things to fit nice definitions, but there is a huge amount of subjectivity here. And in some cases, there will be patrol officers who are investigating offences that might hit a definition, but it's right that they're the right person to deal with it. The point of the CSE team is to understand everything that's coming in, who's got it, are they doing a proper job? Yes, they are. No, they're not. Okay, let's offer some command and control and advice. Never complacent, particularly in the area of vulnerability, but I think our focus as a force on vulnerability is strong.
So in terms of the issue that I've just talked about, as in the development of modern slavery and human trafficking, and CSE as a societal issue to which the police are having to respond to, looking to the year ahead, are you reassured that some further progress can be made to ensure that all of the tools available and the complexities of what's being happened to our communities that can be used to help safeguard and protect those who are potentially subject currently to those behaviours?
I am, for a number of reasons. Firstly, we're driven as an executive and as a police force to focus in this area. It's what we're motivated to do. Secondly, with the child protection gold and the structures that Rachel Jones is putting in place, that offers me some reassurance. Our dedicated detective superintendent working to a chief superintendent on vulnerability also gives me some comfort. And finally, our control strategy that makes it a definitive priority for us in West Mercia Police also gives me some reassurance. Now, please don't conflate that reassurance with complacency. I know we will make mistakes next year. That is the nature of policing, but we are one where we want to learn from it. Richard?
Just two further tactical examples, if I may. One is we're seeking to develop the work of our intelligence officers to be more focused on intelligence gleaned from online sources, specifically social media profiles and content. And we know that that can be a facilitator of child sexual exploitation, perhaps a greater means of us being able to establish where there may be evidence of exploitation in our communities. And then secondly, we spoke about that within the definition of CSE, a proportion of the offending is committed online. We have a team in the north and south areas of the force dedicated to dealing with online child sexual exploitation, which has been subject to an increase in resourcing in the last 12 months and will be subject to another increase in resourcing in the next 12 months, together with an investment in improving the technology we use to examine what is on people's devices that have been seized. So movement of resource and increasing of capability to tackle the threat.
Okay. If I may raise something on the back of that, Commissioner, on the back of Richard's comments, the way it works is the big social media providers, Facebook, Snapchat, etc., Instagram, when they detect CSE and child abuse, and it's worth distinguishing the two, they make referrals to the National Crime Agency, it comes to us and we investigate them. I think this year, we call it the clear web, but they are going to end-to-end encryption, which means that those companies will not be able to detect the child abuse going online on their platforms. It's been called out. It's a real risk and threat for the citizens of this country and West Mercia. And my call to members of the public is, if you are a guardian or a parent, in the absence of that referral that may well reduce as a result of the end-to-end encryption, we've got to be really cognizant of what our children are experiencing online. And similarly, if people can make representations to those social media companies around the checks and balances that take place, that would be helpful. The other beneficial point coming in is the online safety bill that came in November, that does offer some opportunities and some culpability for organisations. They need senior managers to know that they're doing everything they can within, for example, Instagram or Facebook to protect. So, thank you.
Let's move on then to recommendation 20.
Thank you. So recommendation 20 is in relation to how we share information around HIV. So clearly was an issue, and as you can imagine, with medical confidentiality, could be interpreted as a minefield. Luckily, I'm pleased to say here, the information sharing protocols with suitable legal advice have been put in place, and we're reassured that where that becomes important, that information is shared.
So has it worked? Has that information, has there been instances since that's been in place where the thing that we are trying to make happen has then happened as a result?
I think at the moment it's too early for us to say. So we very recently, with the partners involved, have established a framework to inform decision making. So there are greater gateways that exist to us to share information regarding someone's HIV status when there's a health risk to others or in pursuance of a criminal investigation. To the very best of my knowledge, in the time since that framework is agreed, there haven't been any cases that have come to our attention to test it, but I would have to double check that.
Is there how could you gain reassurance that the framework and that agreement is being used? I mean, is there some independent audit that could be done in order to identify if individuals who are HIV positive and involved in investigations are rightly being identified? I mean, is there is there some sort of checks here that could be put in place? You have the agreement, but how do you know it can be lived, I guess?
I think the numbers of cases that we would be likely to be talking about are of of small enough numbers that any audit is unlikely to be compelling, in that the harm caused would be extremely acute, but we are talking about a very small number of instances. There is a partners planning day or discussion day at which this is being considered very soon. So I think it's more a case of testing the framework. It's already been subject and informed by specialist legal advice from a specialist King's Counsel. I think that the proof will be in the pudding in terms of what's likely to be 1 or 2 instances, which we have to get right because of the consequence involved. I don't think a schedule of audit that might come up with a percentage figure in terms of has the framework be applied will be particularly instructive because of the small numbers. But it is subject to regular conversation and testing, and has been in its creation by the professionals involved.
So we're just going to take a very brief comfort break. Thank you. So we're going to move on now to 29.
Yeah, I think it's important, Commissioner, we all recognise the vital piece of work that taxi drivers do, men and women across our towns, protecting a lot of people, getting people home. They're also victims of crime, but for a very small minority, they can also be the perpetrators of crime. And it's important that we as the police work with licensing authorities to be aware of what they can do, how we can protect them, but also to ensure that they themselves are not involved in CSE, as a very small minority have been in the past. So this is about training of the enforcement teams, the licensing teams, police officers who work with those teams, ensuring that CSE is very much on the agenda, A, and then B, the operations that they take. It's not just about compliance with a license or fare evasion and all of that. It's actually making sure, taking a more nuanced look, who are you transporting, are all the protective measures in place, and ensuring that CSE isn't being perpetrated by a tiny minority of private hire vehicles or taxi drivers in any areas in West Mercia.
In the operational report that you provided me for today's meeting, it doesn't set out any details in relation to volumes or the effectiveness or indeed the quality of some of the work that's engaged in and around this recommendation. It would be, I think, beneficial to me as Commissioner to understand the volume that this is likely to involve, because there are a significant number of hackney carriages in West Mercia and in Telford. So understanding the volumes and then whether or not the interventions are working, I think is important. I'm just interested as to how that would get represented in your normal performance regimes or in your normal governance structures.
So it's not, to be frank, represented in our performance regime or structures, other than when a taxi driver is involved as a witness to a crime, a victim of a crime, or a perpetrator of crime. Then it would be. But even then, we don't aggregate that up to understand better what the issues are in a taxi community in an area. Having said that, some recent interventions, we are building stronger partnerships in some of our towns and cities across West Mercia, where senior leaders within the taxi firms are meeting with senior leaders within policing to understand some of the issues and the challenges that are taking place. That in particular instance is in Worcestershire, after the Deputy PCC engaged with some of the taxi firms in Worcester. CSE plays a part in that, and I know this is about CSE, but there is a wider piece of work that goes on in relation to taxi firms.
So let me be blunter and simpler then. How do you get the reassurance that your work around taxi licence enforcement, because I know it's only an element for policing, but how do you get the reassurance that your work and focus on it is proportionate and indeed purposeful, i.e. is making the difference that you want it to make?
So I think that you'd experience that at a local level. I haven't got that reassurance as the Chief Constable. I think the Joint CSE Review Group would be receiving intelligence from the operations that have taken place if CSE was believed to be taking place, and it would feature in the annual report. It would feature in our problem profiles for CSE, and I think those would be immediately elevated to senior leaders within the organisation to say there's CSE, we're concerned that taxi drivers here are involved in it. I haven't seen that. in the last year. I don't know if you have, Richard, but the point you make around aggregate all those taxi operations together, what's the output that's taking place? How can you be reassured around the efficacy of it, or otherwise we can look at? I think Jamie Dunn, who's the superintendent in Telford, will know the answer to that question, and we can find out and get back to you.
Because for example, I went to go and see an operation that the force ran in North Worcestershire last week. It was multi-agency operation, both people were there from the Department of Transport, the District Council and West Mercia Police. And at the end of that operation, in social media and other things, the force put out the number of defect tyres, drink driver, those kind of things. And this was the intervention. I think understanding the so what from the work, I think, is particularly reassuring to the public to know that their Hackney carriage fleet is safe. But second of all, I think helps give a reassurance that there is the intervention that perhaps the recommendation was alluding to wasn't necessarily happening, and has got some longevity, i.e., when we move on to the future and there are other leaders in the system, that it is then just part of what West Mercia does.
Yes, well, we certainly seek that, and I can seek that information and get back to you in relation to the taxi interventions in Telford itself. I don't know if you have any further information, Rich.
Well, I don't know the numbers. I am confident that more enforcement operations are happening than was previously the case. I think it's foreseeable that the absence of any CSE-related intelligence arising from those operations might actually represent success. Okay. One thing we are doing qualitatively differently is previously we were undertaking with the council apply for hire operations, so a test purchaser in our language, an official masquerading as a member of the public would seek to be picked up. That would have some benefit in terms of what we're here to discuss today in terms of CSE, in that it may reveal taxis that weren't taxis but operating as such, so drivers seeking to pick up people who were vulnerable. But what it didn't tell us was anyone being carried around in a taxi who may either be a perpetrator or survivor of CSE. We're now undertaking jointly with licensing officers mobile operations, so a marked car with a council licensing officer, a police officer in stopping taxis, which has the benefit of potentially revealing who the passengers are and if there are any CSE concerns arising, which the apply for hire operations didn't. I understand the point that we need to make sure that that's not having a disproportionate impact on people operating a lawful business. But at the same time, I think that development has been specifically driven by the inquiry report in terms of us clarifying our role, identifying designated points of contact for the local authority around taxing and around taxis, and developing the way we try and take enforcement activity.
Could I just confirm, for the purposes of this recommendation, that taxis are being taken to include private hire vehicles as well as Hackney carriages, so they're both encompass. Obviously, how they come across passengers, and you've mentioned, Richard, about the applying for hire issues, but they're both within scope. Yes. in terms of our activities. Okay, thank you. That's helpful. Claire?
Around the mobile operations, are you reassured that there's an even spread of timings of the activity, i.e. are they going out at various points in the day, or is it just a daytime initiative?
I don't know the answer to that question, but I know that that's one of the benefits of the mobile operations is that they aren't limited to the same locations, which will obviously make them easier to avoid. I don't have the same specific knowledge in respect of times and dates, but I can happily find out the information for you.
Thank you. Let's move on then to another licensed activity, which is recommendation 31.
Thank you. And, this bears some similarity to taxis in that historically food safety enforcement was the problem that inspections were looking at in relation to restaurants. Very similar to taxis, they offer a brilliant service to communities and they're often victim to crime themselves. However, sometimes a tiny minority can also be the mechanism through which CSE takes place. So we defined CSE, didn't we, where somebody wants something and in exchange for a sexual favour they receive that thing. That could be fast food, and it could be a meeting venue as well, where vulnerable children are met by people who want to abuse them. So here we need a change of emphasis where, yes, food safety is inspected, but also are there any concerns in relation to CSE? What's that looking like? In this circumstance, a protocol has been put together where when the inspection is taking place, there's a checklist which includes highlighting any concerns in relation to CSE, and the protocol is in place where if there is concerns, that it's sent through to the child sexual exploitation team and the appropriate work can take place to understand whether that is a risk or a threat and any further action that needs to take place.
So, nighttime economy, takeaway establishments featured in Operation Chalice that was referred to a little earlier. Clearly an area where this CSE has happened and been associated with. And again, a very small part of the nighttime economy, to be clear, but a definite feature in the offending that has been identified and was considered part of the inquiry. In your report that you provided us for this meeting, we don't have necessarily some of the tactical detail that might not always be in these documents. Are you reassured that the tactical detail is being considered by somebody senior enough in West Mercia Police to do something about it? I know there's been a lot of discussion about the superintendent, for example, because it might be that the West Mercia Police are in the nighttime economy in these establishments for different purposes. It's how you get the reassurance of this intelligence going up to those who are overseeing some of these areas of business, and then it's making sure that all parts of West Mercia and the wider system can intervene if necessary and understand if there is a problem in this area of our society.
Yes, I'll ask Rich to come in a bit. My expectation as chief is if there was organised child sexual exploitation taking place by taxi drivers anywhere in West Mercia, I as chief would want to know. I think people accept that, and our daily pay setter would highlight information like that would come across my table. In relation to day-to-day reporting, Richard, is there anything further you want to add?
I'm more talking about the nighttime economy element in terms of the fast food and all those kind of premises.
So I recently asked for any examples of information that have been generated as a result of the eyes and ears checklist training that have been given to food safety officers and others, and the detective chief inspector for the Telford area, who's responsible for crime and vulnerability there, was very quickly able to furnish me with details of the intelligence that had been received, and she was aware of some ongoing work that was underway to determine whether a policing response was necessary. So that's relatively recent, so I can't provide any further detail regarding what that intelligence was, but again, the senior officer charged with investigation of crime on the LPA was aware of the specific intelligence that had arisen.
So anecdotally, it sounds like there is product from the activity.
Yes.
That's helpful. Thank you. Going to move on to recommendation 36.
Thank you. This is where we'll dive into a bit of detail, and it's worth clarifying perhaps three things. So when an allegation is made or when a crime is reported, we investigate the crime as appropriate. Across many different crime types, we also add markers to that crimes so that when we search across our systems, we can search against the marker and it gives us an understanding of prevalence, geography and frequency of that crime type in a particular area. So in this instance, we're interested in CSA and CSE. So does a crime that concerns CSA or CSE have the appropriate marker on it? It doesn't mean that it hasn't been investigated if it doesn't have the marker on it. It means that our picture of CSE reporting in West Mercia won't be as good as it should be. So that's the first point. Does the crime have a CSE marker on it? The second point is, do individuals who we have suspicion are engaged in CSE have personal markers on their name on our police national computer systems? And so that's also important. So if someone is stopped, for example, in a taxi or when they're going somewhere and we check their name and their name comes up and says there is a CSE warning marker on this individual, makes us ask further questions. It enhances our professional curiosity. So we're interested in whether there's a marker on the crime and whether there's a marker on the person. The third point, before I pass to Rich on the audits that have taken place, comes back to definitions. We've said it's a broad church, and this is where it can become complex, because if you take the government definition, which is good and fit and sound, it can be interpreted quite widely. And if you take a much more focused definition, which is the commodification of women being sold from man to man to man, that is a much finer definition. And depending where you sit on that boundary will depend on whether something should get a marker or not. And even in the wide definition, for some of the offences, you and I could have a good debate around, is that or isn't it? But it's worth digging into the audits now and giving you some reassurance or otherwise on the work that has taken place. So, Richard.
Thank you. This is complicated. We didn't have a good understanding of this area before the findings of the inquiry chair. We've undertaken 3 detailed audits so far to try and understand our use of the CSE marker system and its effectiveness, and have committed to at least yearly audits going forward. We've audited a group of crimes relating to children who were referred to the children abused through exploitation team, and found that the results were reassuring and positive in terms of the crimes having been applied with the relevant marker. Then a series of crimes relating to offences linked to modern slavery and human trafficking. Overwhelmingly, they were in respect of child sexual abuse. Over 3/4 of those which we were judged to be meeting the child sexual exploitation definition had been also. But going back to the Chief Constable's earlier point around the definition, those where the flag of CSE hadn't, in our view, been applied to the crime when perhaps it should have done. There were 6 instances. 5 of them appeared to involve children as perpetrator and victim or survivor under the age of 17. So they weren't the sort of exploitation that we would consider being dealt with by our child sexual exploitation teams in the main, that extreme exploitation of children for financial gain by a number of individuals. But we are introducing and have introduced safeguards to try and up that compliance even further. So on a daily basis, every crime, which is a sexual crime where the victim is aged under 18, is subject to review by our investigation management unit, who quality assure all our crime recording purposes. And so that's a safeguard to ensure that better flags are applied, because as we pointed out, we need to know what the scale of the issue is. And then the other point I would make there is in respect of offenders and victims, that same team will in the future ensure that markers have been applied to the individuals involved in those offences, so that should they be come across by officers and staff in the future, we can identify that they've been involved in CSE matters.
So I'm in no way underplaying the fact by stating that this is an incredibly complex and technical bit of bureaucracy, let alone the societal behaviour that is having to be identified, tracked, recorded, etc. under these different areas. The feedback I've had from is around justice. So getting somebody held accountable and indeed it being recognised as to what has happened, and the accuracy around how that is recorded and the person who's perpetrated it being held accountable for that is really important. And the cost of those who do step forward and retell their experiences. Part of my commitment to that person's strength to be able to do that is that we can deliver more justice for people, i.e. they might get safeguarded, but also how we then ensure that the right crime that they would also identify is what that person is held accountable for. And I suppose a very broad question, I'm interested in your views, as to whether or not the work that West Mercia Police is doing within the confines of the law and the regulations that you have to work in will help ensure that more victims and survivors would be able to identify that they are getting the justice in relation to the crime that they would identify they've been the victim of.
So, Commissioner, I think you're asking that question in relation to flags and markers in particular.
Yeah.
Because I think a lot of today has been around raising the awareness of CSE and the importance of justice. Flags and markers assist with that. The flags in particular allow us to have a mature understanding of what CSE is taking place across West Mercia that enables us to put our asset or focus on as appropriate at a strategic level. The markers on individuals allows us to, when we do our proactive stops, be much more professionally curious and think, okay, there might be an offence here. So definitely they would assist in us getting justice for victims. So if, for example, we stop someone with a marker, they're involved in CSE and they happen to be with a young girl who may or may not be under their influence, who may or may not appear vulnerable, and there's a power differential, I think we would take much more assertive action as a result of that marker, which is why it's important to get it right.
We've spoken about the typologies of CSE and that commoditising of children for sexual gain. Where our confidence is greatest regarding flags and markers are those crimes which were investigated by the child exploitation team. So in all areas of the force, that team and the child exploitation coordinator within it will ensure that flags and markers are applied to the crimes and individuals that team are investigating. So where we consider the risk to be greatest, the greatest level of exploitation, accepting that all CSE is child abuse, those matters are where we have greatest confidence that flags and markers are applied, because the child exploitation team will take responsibility for it. And then we're trying to ensure through the provision of CSE training to the entire workforce and the role of the investigation management unit in checking that wider church of potential offences are scrutinised to ensure that the right markers are applied.
Thank you. In terms of markers, you mentioned in the written brief that most ones that you came across, most of it in the audit that had the marker applied. What reassurance can you provide around the intelligence from those that didn't have markers applied? Have there been any gaps identified in specific areas for those ones that didn't have a marker?
I can't say with absolute certainty that the work to ensure that every missed marker must be rectified has been completed, but that has been the exact conversation that I've had with the tactical lead superintendent to ensure that when we've not applied a crime flag, and we should have done, that we put all of those right, and that when we identify an individual where a marker hasn't been applied, that we go back through all the flagged crimes to determine whether there should now be a marker applied to the individual. So again, I'm confident in respect of the crimes that have been dealt with by the child exploitation teams that our processes have been robust, but I can be absolutely unambiguous that the instruction has been given to apply markers whenever our judgment is that they've been missed.
Training being at the heart of that being done successfully, I assume.
Certainly in terms of the overall awareness of the workforce. So we would expect any officer investigating a matter that meets the definition of CSE to consider whether flags and markers should be applied and take responsibility for that themselves. That even with the training that is being delivered and will be delivered, that will increase the base level, but such is the severity of the crime and the role of flags and markers that we need to have a backstop in place that's provided through either the CE team or through the investigation management unit. But yeah, absolutely, training will hopefully raise the overall standard, but then we still need a checking mechanism.
I think it's worth saying that in parallel, what is equally, stroke even more significant is the quality of the investigation, which is immaterial in relation to the marker. And there's a huge amount of work, Commissioner, as you know, going on in relation to have we conducted this with the appropriate reasonable lines of inquiry? Has there been supervisory work on the crime? And the incidents that have been missed are where markers have been missed. A, there's a subjective assessment around whether they were needed or not. But B, we were also really interested in was a proper job done on them in any case. And there's work going across the force to ensure, you know, it's virtually one of our number one priorities to ensure that we are dealing with investigations expeditiously and thoroughly.
Okay.
Just on the subject of training around flags, are you reassured that the links are there in relation to modern slavery and this link between CSE and modern slavery in terms of that training of the flags?
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, a bit like CSE, there's been a wider definition in relation to modern slavery. So I think the modern slavery markers are, for what most people would consider to be modern slavery, we're pretty good at. When it becomes more subjective, obviously there's more variation, and then the crossover with CSE, and this is particularly pertinent to national referral mechanism referrals, and it's, you know, you're right to ask the question, well, what about human slavery and CSE have the NRM referrals gone into? But when you look at what an NRM referral is for, and you apply the wider definition of CSE, you'd go that you know, if you talk about two people online, you go, I'm not sure an NRM referral would help. It might actually be counterproductive because you begin to lose the ability to see the wood for the trees, you know, and you get so many NRM referrals coming through. Was an NRM referral made for the right job is a good question to ask, and we are working with the consultees who are also really interested in how our NRM referrals are taking place for CSE, whether we're doing it appropriately and rightly. I think, you know, what the local authority and the Home Office probably don't want is a huge waterfall of NRM referrals because we've been too mechanistic about it. What are we trying to seek with a referral, and its access to services and support? Would it have been right in this occasion or not? And that's what we need to go through on a case-by-case basis.
I want to move on to recommend 37, which is around the same theme around training, around the staff and for officers.
Thank you. So we have commissioned a training provider called NWG to do the training. There's been several iterations. Again, the feedback from the consultees has been really useful to go back and change that training. That's currently being worked through at the moment, and then we are rolling out the training to all our staff in the spring.
So the idea is that everybody in West Mercia Police would receive the training, officers and staff.
I don't think everybody, but
There's certainly everyone in a public-facing role, including those who would have contact with the public over the phone. So, for example, our contact handling staff.
How many, you've got an idea of the workforce of over 1,500, how many, what sort of percentage do you think are likely to be the recipient of this training?
I don't have a number, but I would imagine it's 3,000 to 3,500 people.
There's an area, one of the areas in the recommendations that perhaps hasn't yet is as fully developed as some of the others. Are you reassured that this is going to remain on track, and indeed that the training get delivered in the spring of this year, as you just alluded to, or because I understand that there are some concerns around, and it will always be a choice, won't it, as in how the training is delivered, what's in it, etc. But the day, a product that will give confidence to those that have been victim or survivor of this particular crime type, reassurance to the public, effective to the staff and the officers that work in this area. Are you reassured that you're going to get to a position where a product that is fit for purpose will be able to be delivered?
Yes. Having said that, I think there will always be a variation of opinion on the quality of the training, both from people involved in the training and people receiving it. But we are, and the people involved in it are satisfied with the training. We're training the trainers, and that's when and they will then deliver the training that goes out to the rest of the organisation. It's about 4.5 hours long, and it's a sizable commitment, rightly so, for us to abstract people for more than half a day's tour of duty so that they can be brought up to speed and be fully cognizant of all the aspects of child sexual exploitation.
Will it be mandatory?
Yes.
Okay.
We've agreed with the training provider that the product will be updated on a yearly basis so that it remains under review as to whether it's hitting the mark and relevant as we get new people joining the organisation. And I've been impatient with our progress on this recommendation, but I would point out, having been through some of the material myself, that the review of our training provision was a fundamental part of the recommendation. And that has involved a really forensic and incredibly laborious review of essentially every lesson plan delivered to PCSOs, to detention officers, to front counter clerks, going through the relevant syllabus of new student training, of training given to contact handlers to determine the extent to which there was a gap and how it's best filled. So the foundation work to ensure that the training is appropriate has been a really significant undertaking by those charged with it.
Are you reassured that the voice of those who've been victim or sort of survivors of this particular crime type are sufficient in informing? Because it must be a matter for force to decide what their training is for their staff. Absolutely. Are you reassured that the voice of the victim and survivors will be appropriately in there?
Yes. Ultimately, as you say, we need to determine what we think the training needs to provide, informed by that victim's voice. But we need to get on with delivering the training at the very start of the next financial year. But I am confident of the amount of engagement that has been undertaken and that we will start delivering an effective product very soon.
Okay.
In relation to the training, and particularly around the 101 staff, and potentially those that are based in some of the CSE teams locally, is there a variation in training package, or are you able to provide reassurance in relation to the speciality content of that training package so that it's tailored to those that perhaps have first initial contact with the public, for example, 101, and those that are very involved in detailed and complex investigations? Is there a varied approach, or is it?
So the operational contact centre, those within the organisation who answer calls for service from the public, are going to be the first recipients of the training. And so that will give us a chance to determine the extent to which, whether it needs to be varied thereafter or whether we need to change elements for the rest of those teams. We've also been engaging with the senior leadership team within the operational contact department regarding something more specialist for them.
Okay, so let's move on then into 38 and complaints.
Thank you. So again, raised through the inquiry the issue of the complexity of navigating the complaints department and some of the jargon that we do use. Police are guilty of that in how we sometimes communicate, particularly legally, with complainants or with the public generally. And pleased to say that the liaison has taken place, the process has been simplified and some of the language has been changed.
And so obviously, like all large organisations, you use computer systems and systems for recording. What update will you have made to things like your complaint recording programs within the professional standards department, for example, that does recognise the difference around CSE and CSA?
I'll hand over to Deputy here, who line manages the PSD department.
We've increased our ability to be able to identify complaints in relation to CSE. Those are brought to my attention and they feature within the conversations that professional standards department have with you, Commissioner, as well on a quarterly basis. And we're currently seeking to identify a greater means by which we can have improved confidence that all matters that might be raised with any member of the constabulary relating to a complaint regarding CSE find their way onto that recording system. So I think we can be confident that the great majority of people who have a complaint regarding the police will either raise it through the public contact centre, directly to the professional standards department, or through a trusted third party such as an elected representative or a charity provider. All those routes mean that the complaint will arrive with the professional standards department, be tagged within their system and tracked. We need to ensure that if a matter is raised, for example, with a local supervisor, that the same rigour applies. We have introduced in the last 12 months a new training regime for new sergeants and inspectors, and a professional standards input features within that, which is a means of upping their knowledge to ensure that if you do receive a complaint from a member of the public, even if you think it's something that you might be able to resolve yourself locally, it needs to be brought to the attention of professional standards for recording. I need to ensure greater confidence myself in this area going forward. I would be extremely surprised if a complaint regarding a matter of CSE, if made to a local officer, wasn't brought to the attention of the professional standards department, given the severity for inclusion then on their systems.
In the reviewing that I've done, in terms of part of my statutory role at PCC, it's not a high level, it's a very small level.
In numbers? In numbers,
in volumes. Are you reassured that it is representative, it's at the right level that it should be? Because I hear the point absolutely around increasing the confidence that they end up where they need to end up at the centre. But second of all, are you reassured that they are at the right volume?
I'm reassured, and I'm confident that those complaints that are made to the police end up in the right place. I think that a fundamental reason why complaints may not be made in the first place is because of the question of confidence in us. So I would hope that sessions such as these are a commitment to increase the standards of investigation, our commitment to treat victims with more compassion than some of the findings that led to the report in the first place, will increase my level of assurance and that of the Chief Constable that complaints are being made. That's where I think if there is a gap, that is where it will exist, rather than complaints being made but not finding their way to the professional standards team.
how do you reassure in something that is a bureaucratic process, reassure those back to the humans who either want to complain, don't feel empowered to complain, or don't have confidence in the service, but actually it is fit for purpose in dealing and identifying with those who haven't had the right level of service around something around child sexual exploitation?
We are very keen that the leaders of our professional standards department have the benefit of speaking with survivors themselves, which is something we are in the process of trying to arrange. The other element that I think can give a more meaningful service and benefit to those who have complained about, particularly an investigative outcome, is that the professional standards department frequently, with many cases, other sexual offences as well as those related to child sex exploitation, explain the victim right to review to those who have complained. So they may not, their complaint may be general, because why should anyone have an understanding of police conduct and complaint procedures, not happy with the outcome of the investigation that has gone on to their offence? The victim's right to review is a statutory means by which a victim can seek review by a more senior and independent officer of the outcome in their case. And there are examples of the professional standards department directing victims who weren't aware of that service towards it, and also in other cases of involving local senior detectives and informing the professional standards department view of what should have happened. So I don't think we treat complaints as a bureaucratic process around the regulations. I think we seek to deliver the best outcome for the victim, be that through the victim's right to review or involving a senior local investigator in trying to rectify matters.
Alex, a more organisational question. How do you ensure West Mercia Police can hear the voices of those who have experienced this and lots of other crimes without them further traumatising those individuals?
Yeah, it's a real challenge, isn't it? We do this in a number of ways. Firstly, some victims are able to talk through their victim journey, and they know that they're making a change to how policing operates. And we use those victims to communicate to the wider police audience to say, this is what I've been through. And sometimes that can be good for the victim because they feel they're making a change to a system that hasn't treated them as appropriately beforehand. Otherwise, we can, a bit like you've done with me, Commissioner, we can hear the story once, record it, and then send that story out to our officers. In one of our last holding to account, in the PowerPoint slides, we had an audio version of the victims speaking about some good but largely bad experiences at the hands of police. That's how we can get it out without re-traumatising victims, because as you mentioned, I recognise the impact that can have on victims, and when that has happened, I'm sorry that has happened. And the other thing we need to work really hard on is victim blaming language. And you know, back in the day, and where child sexual exploitation got it so wrong, the investigation of it was this horrible word around lifestyle choice. And the whole point of being better at investigating CSE is we look at the whole situation around a victim, all the pressures, all the adverse childhood experiences they may or may not have been through, all the trauma that they've been through. We make a much more considered opinion. And I need to reflect on how I speak as Chief Constable, and similarly, Her Majesty's Inspector at Constabulary, they listen to calls on a very regular basis looking for victim blaming language. And we are not seeing evidence of that victim blaming language, but we're very alive to it, and we will need to be conscious of it.
Thank you. Helpful. Moving on then to recommendation 39.
Thank you. So the national referral mechanism, again, this is a really useful way of opening the doors to services and support for victims of child sexual exploitation and human trafficking, modern slavery. Have taken place in Telford to improve what we do here. The local authority has recruited a NRM coordinator, and those NRMs are reviewed with a member of the child sexual exploitation team, so we can get a better understanding of what's taking place. So two things then really. Are we submitting NRMs when we should be? That's work that we need to assure ourselves on, and then the quality of the NRMs that are submitted also needs to be good, and that's across human trafficking, CSE, and when they cross over.
Thank you. There is a theme, isn't there, around CSE being identified for what it is, and I know at several points in today's discussion we've talked about the complexities of that. How do you give that wider reassurance that the complexity that we've just talked about here, complexity we talked about several times, being worked through, understood, processed, the training, how do you give that reassurance that all these things add up to the right referrals being made, the right markers being applied? How do you give that confidence to the public that the journey is ongoing and progress is being made? Because the referrals, for example, aren't just a bureaucratic process. There is a purpose
Absolutely
around it, and the right instances getting that referral vitally important. But how do you give that wider reassurance overall?
The reassurance comes as follows. I think if we were to expect our 2,500 police officers, many who are very young in service, to know all the subtleties and requirements of every case they deal with, from CSE to human trafficking to burglary, robbery, theft and online crime, it's an impossible ask of anyone, let alone the Chief Constable, which is why we have specialists, experts and points of contact and channels through which we submit crimes, so that people who do know can understand and can check that the right referrals are in place, that they're the best quality with the right levels of flagging. So, for example, the incident management unit that Richard spoke of earlier, all crimes go through that funnel, and they do have the expertise to say, has there been an issue here? Our CSE coordinators on a local policing area will look at all offences every day, and when they see something, they'll go, that's relevant, and they'll apply their expertise to say, has the right referral gone in, and is it of a suitable quality? And then we have audits that take place. So we look at 80 crimes per month per LPA to see that there's reasonable lines of inquiry, and we always learn from that. You know, they are never perfect. So I think there's quite a lot in place to give us that reassurance, but we can never be 100% assured, which is the ongoing challenge and the ongoing focus for us.
Thank you. Let's move to recommendation 41 then.
Thank you. So, Commissioner, I can only speak from personal experience how regularly I'm held to account by yourself, and I can also say that particularly in the last audit and assurance meetings, accountability and assurance meetings, the voice of the victim has been profound and impactful. And then also on a regular basis, we meet on a weekly basis, and then to talk through critical incidents that have affected the force and areas of concern that you go through with me. So I think about policing. I don't want to live in a police state. I recognise the importance of a democratically elected police and crime commissioner to hold me to account, so that there is a genuine golden thread between the community and policing, and it's something that I see as essential in policing.
Usually within our holding to account activity, and indeed in these assurance and accountability sessions, the voice of the victim would be represented, because of the way that we're conducting the meeting today. That hasn't happened. Are you reassured that the approach within the organisation that you lead is cognizant of the value of scrutiny that you alluded to, and indeed that theme of openness and transparency goes throughout the organisation?
No, I'm not confident on that. But there is, at different sections in policing, I want people to concentrate on different things. I want our patrol officers and investigators to be thorough investigators. And I reflect on my time as an investigator. I was not thinking about the Chief Constable or the Police and Crime Commissioner. I was thinking about how I do a good job for this victim of crime, and that's where I'd want them to concentrate on. Their view of transparency and accountability, whilst important, I'd rather have that they had a view on how can I do the best job possible for the victim. Then as you go through the organisation, it becomes more apparent and more necessary to be transparent and to be accountable. And that's where I'd expect that maturity of approach to be there. We can have there's a wider debate to be had in relation to frequency and things like that. And people across the country have got different views on governance of policing. But that's probably not for this meeting, is it?
Thank you, and thank you for running through the recommendations. Just an opportunity, if you just wanted to set out for me what you would see over the next 12 months, the progress that you would want to, just very briefly, what progress would you want to see the force make in terms of tackling CSE?
Well, I'd stress to you our commitment to deal with CSE, recognising it for the horrific offence that it is. Strategically, it's a priority for us. We have put investment into officers dedicated to tackling CSE, and the improvements I'd like to see over the next 12 months, and indeed what we've referred to as beyond ITSE, is improvements in the recording of CSE, in the investigative quality of CSE, and probably most importantly, the awareness of CSE delivered through a training approach that will cover the whole of the organisation, where people begin to understand all the nuance and vulnerability associated with CSE, what to look out for, how to be professionally curious, how to hear the voice of the child, how to look beyond what is necessarily being presented to them, either on a telephone call or in person.
Thank you. We've recognised and you've recognised it yourself, Alex, but I want to recognise the independent report highlighting some of the failures that have happened in the past and the potential failures potentially could be happening now, and the importance to understand how we learn from the past to inform the future. And I'm grateful for the significant organisational focus. I think it is a good summary to say that there is progress in some areas. There are other areas where there still needs to be some further progress made. As Commissioner, I absolutely welcome the progress that is made and your focus and organisational focus that you lead upon it. But I'm also under no illusion that it is job done. There is societal progress to be made, but there is also organisational progress for the organisation to which I'm the governance for. Under no illusion, job done. This is about progress, and indeed around the recommendations, we're not job done either. And so really important that focus continues. And my part, I will continue using my power to hold to account through my assurance and accountability sessions, but also direct resources to support the work in your organisation. I know through the latest budget round that we've just gone through your operational advice and my support, there are additional resources there, and I know that builds on previous years' worth of investment. And indeed, the other point I was just going to make was around that recommitment to ensuring that those who have been devastated by the horrific crime that child sexual exploitation is, that they will continue to have a voice and be heard in that process. That we know that is that the cycle of improvement and indeed progress of this issue through society and through policing. Alex and Richard, thank you very much for taking part in this meeting, but also for the report that was prepared to assist in this meeting, being able to look at the different parts of it. And I shall let you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.